welcome to a real business of wine session on Bordeaux and on publishing and all sorts of other things with Jane Anson, who's an old friend of mine, well, an old friend of mine, but a friend of mine from many years back, but also very much a friend of Real Business of Wine, because Jane was brought along a group of Bordelais very early on in our little project to talk about the question of En Primeur, whether En Primeur was going to happen in Bordeaux, and then we had a broader session on that. And since then, Jane's book, Inside Bordeaux, has come out. I would love to bluff and tell you that I've read every single word of it. I haven't. It's arrived late because of the situation of coronavirus and actually getting books dispatched, and I don't live in London and so on. But I know enough about the book and I know enough about Jane, I hope to be able to start the ball rolling. And the great thing about having Jane as I said, a friend of long standing, is I'll give her a slightly harder time possibly than I might with somebody I didn't know. So my first question, Jane, is why do we need another book on Bordeaux? There are a lot of them.
I'm so happy that you asked that, because that is exactly the question I ask in the opening page, as you will find out when it arrives, hopefully tomorrow. And the main reason I felt was that we somehow feel that we know Bordeaux so well that we actually stop looking at it. We can think Bordeaux is this kind of monolithic, just big business, same big chateaus. We always talk about the same 200 names over and over again. And I very strongly felt living here that is not the whole story. And I wanted to give a different picture. And I started to get a little frustrated with how people talk about Bordeaux. I do mention this as well in the intro, to say that I was in a really wonderful seminar in Rioja about 4 years ago, which was looking at rare grape varieties around Spain, and people who are kind of working with indigenous varieties and trying to make wine a bit more kind of interesting and direct to consumer. Anyway, Bordeaux came up, and all of the other producers in the room literally sniggered at the thought that Bordeaux could possibly have anything to do with terroir, could possibly have this authentic experience of dealing with people who drink it. And it just really set something off in me of thinking, it's wrong that we only look at Bordeaux in this way. So I have tried very, very hard to do a book which has got one voice, because it's me talking throughout, giving my opinion, but trying to highlight what's happening, what's new in Bordeaux, the young producers. I've tried to give just as much credit and space in the book to Lalonde de Pomerol and Fronsac, as well as to Pauillac and Saint Julien. And I do a lot of work with a professor here to look at the terroirs of Bordeaux. So I hope to try to make it simple, but to show that there is actually life in Bordeaux. There's a lot happening, and it's 700 pages, so I cover quite a bit of it. But the aim was to give a slightly fresh conversation about Bordeaux.
So let's backtrack. How long have you been living there?
So I came here in 2003, and I think it's fair to say in 2003, Bordeaux was 200% new oak in some places. It was very much the Parker years, very, very much big extraction, long hang time. It was particularly on the right bank. It was really a very different world. It was also pre-China coming in a big way. And I've been very lucky to be here while so much has evolved. The difference of how Bordeaux was then and now has certainly given me a lot to talk about and write about over the last, now 17 years.
So let's look at the multi-dimensional thing that Bordeaux is. So on the one hand, we've got the Great Chateau, and the Great Chateau in itself seems to me to be multi-dimensional, because we've got great little cottages, if you like, in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion, and great chateau, castles, palaces in the Médoc, competing for the same wine lovers, wine investors dollar. And then you've got the rest of Bordeaux, which is going down in strata, the Cru Bourgeois, we can definitely talk about that. But then the Petit Chateau, and the figure that I always use is how we used to have an extraordinary 20,000 of those. The last time I looked, it was 5,600. You may have another number, but I've been told by a negociant in Bordeaux that number will drop to about 3,000 Well, I was told before the current crisis that that would drop to the 3,500 sort of level in the next few years, just by the fact that those chateaux were struggling to keep afloat before the current problem. Can we look at that breakdown of Bordeaux? Is my way of looking at it a fair way?
Your way of looking at it is a very fair way. And there's one particular figure that we've all been looking at recently, and that a lot of people in Bordeaux don't really want to talk about very much, which is the price of bulk wine, the price of en vrac, as it's called, when you sell large quantities of mainly Bordeaux, Bordeaux Superior wine. Remember, those categories, Bordeaux, Bordeaux Superior, make up at least half of all wine produced in this region. So it's a vast amount. And I can remember in 2003, when I moved here, there being a big deal about it dropping below 1,000 euros per tonneau, which is the way they sell it. And today,
that's what, how many bottles? That's
really good question. You know, I meant to look that up before we had this conversation.
Is it 900? I can't remember.
Thank you. I'm sure that's right. It's definitely around. I was going to say 1,000. So yeah. You're right.
It's about a litre. It's about a euro a litre-ish, isn't it? In that sort of
so that exactly. So it was 1,200. It went down to 1,000. It was a really big deal. Today, it's the lowest it's been since the 1980s. It's about 600 euros per tonneau, 600 to 700, and that's very dramatic because you cannot live on that amount. And also it has a knock-on effect on the confidence of the whole market. So it brings down prices in Cru Bourgeois and all of those things higher up the food chain. Now, as you said, Robert, this was a big deal before COVID-19. So it is very worrying what will happen to those smaller estates over the next couple of years. And what we've seen in terms of the reducing of estates is almost certainly going to continue and speed up. I picked out a couple of figures for you that when we were talking about this, in terms of how many, here we go. So over the last 10 years, we've lost about 10,000 hectares in Bordeaux, approximately. That's not actually such a bad thing because a lot of them were not such great quality, selling at a low price. And what the actual Bordeaux Wine Bureau has tried to do is to encourage guys who are not making money from it to pull up their vines. So that's not a bad thing. But if you look at the size of the estates, today the average size of an estate is about 17 hectares. But back, not really 10 years ago, but back about 20 years ago, it was about 9 hectares, 8.5 to 9 hectares. What that tells you is people have gone out of business or they've sold up, and so the big guys are getting bigger and the small guys are either getting smaller or they're going out of business. That is not good news for anyone.
Well, when you say that, and we look at this both ways. On the one hand, every single one of those chateau, estates, whatever, is potentially a family and part of a community and so on. But you could argue that, did the world need, you think how many producers there are in the whole of Australia, if you like, the whole of other regions, even 3,500 or 4,000, that's a lot of different brands of the same stuff. Does it logically make sense? One quick question that doesn't often get covered is, how much of Bordeaux is actually made by cooperatives now?
Well, hard to say exactly how much, but more than you might think. So certainly in terms
That's my point. There is a lot of it, isn't there?
So what I can tell you, it's about 70% of Bordeaux is sold through the négociant system. About 30% is sold direct, but some of that will be selling in bulk. And cooperatives, what's happened with cooperatives, the same as with wine estates, is 10 years ago, you would have had a lot of cooperatives. Certain areas would have had 2 or 3. Today, they're much, much, much more streamlined. And so there's one of the biggest is called Uni Medoc, which is up in the Medoc, and that has about 1,000 hectares worth of land which goes into it. It's the system there works to a certain extent because, as you say, there's so much wine produced in this region, and the co-ops often will make the wine which ends up in supermarket brands, or so I mean there are some perfectly reasonable. There's a very, very good cooperative in Saint-Emilion which makes great quality, brilliant wines, which sell very well, and is actually a model in France for one of the cooperatives that really works. But there's no question that for too long they sopped up the bad wine, and that needed to change. So I am not disagreeing with you that all of these small producers should continue, but when the price of on vrac wine drops that low, it hurts not just the not good producers, it hurts everybody. That's what I mean. It hurts also the guys at the cool bourgeois level.
I should say, I think that it's fair to say the quality, the average quality of stuff with Bordeaux on the label, which in the past has often been truly awful, actually these days is much better than it's ever been. And I mean, obviously climate change has helped in terms of green, unripe vintages. And there are some occasional exceptions to that. 13 was a good example, but by and large, if you buy a bottle with Bordeaux on the label, it's going to be drinkable in the way that it wasn't necessarily always drinkable. But those prices, they're actually lower than prices from wine from the Languedoc and possibly even Pinot Grigio and elsewhere. In reality, if we took the word Bordeaux off the label, is the wine really competitive with wine from other regions at the bottom end?
Oh gosh, I have to say I'm not sure I drink enough at the bottom end at those vrac level to really give you an honest answer to that. But that in itself tells you something. And I would say that if I'm looking to buy an inexpensive bottle of wine for maybe €4 or something, if I was going to do it from Bordeaux, I would buy white Bordeaux rather than red Bordeaux because I would feel more confident in what I was getting. And the honest truth is I'd probably buy from the Rhone. I'd probably think, you know what, I'm going to get a cheap Côte de Rhone because I would feel more certain at that level of price that it would be good. Once you get to €10 and above, I really do think Bordeaux has completely unbeatable value compared to equivalent wine regions. I think you'd find it very hard to get such good quality at €10 and above. But I don't think that's necessarily true at €3.
At €10, if we start translating that into pounds or dollars, is going to be significantly more. Now, one of the things I find is that when I talk to people in the UK or indeed other countries, they'll tend to say, you know, you basically inexpensive Bordeaux is great value, not the rock bottom stuff, because what we get outside France very often is some very well bought wine from some of those cooperatives and elsewhere that actually is very good value. And in fact, when I go to France, back to your point, French supermarkets will have a wall of very similarly labeled wines with Bordeaux of one kind or another. And those are the €3-4, €5 Bordeaux, which are very often very questionable. And those are the ones that probably don't get exported as much as they were.
Yes,
because a British supermarket that used to maybe have 5 or 6 or 10 Bordeaux now has maybe got 2 or 3.
I totally agree with you. And in fact, the French sales account for about 60% of all of Bordeaux sales, and that is where the real worry is of what's happening now in terms of that bulk price. Because if they're not buying those wines, then a whole lot of businesses go out of business very quickly, because most of that does end up in French supermarkets. And something that people don't necessarily realize about the En Primeur system is that about a third of En Primeur goes to French supermarkets as well. French supermarkets, or maybe Swiss, Belgium, but grande surface, as they say in France. I can't think what the word is in English, but you know what I mean. Supermarkets.
Hypermarkets and supermarkets.
Thank you, yeah.
And there's another little sort of dirty secret, as it were, where my understanding, there is this thing called La Place de Bordeaux, which is a metaphorical square place, a trading square, which doesn't exist, but it exists where wine is traded. And in theory, the Chinese are very not upset, well, yes, confused and upset to the fact they can't walk into Chateau X or Y and buy a case or 100 cases, because the chateau will say, no, you have to buy it through a négociant here. But then, of course, the négociant that you're going to buy it through may well belong to the people who own the chateau in the first place. So there's a bit of a conceit going on between the layers. And then you have these people called brokers who take a 2% or 3%, whatever margin. Can you explain the structure of why is it that I can, in America, in Australia, in Burgundy, I can go into an estate or a producer and say, can I buy some wine? And they'll say, yes, you can buy it directly from me, or you can buy it from somebody I've appointed as an agent or an importer. Why do we have this structure? And does it work for everyone? Does it work as well for the Sauternes Chateau as it does for the top chateau of the Meadow?
Okay, so if we take that in manageable chunks, first of all, that idea of selling via the Place is about, as we said, 70% of Bordeaux wine, about 30% goes otherwise. The Place is not just En Primeur. That's point one that's quite important. It is, as you say, it's how most wine gets sold in Bordeaux throughout the year. En Primeur is one section of that system. It goes back about 1,000 years, right back to when the English owned, or when the English had this kind of duchy of the southwest of France. And it grew as a way to deal with the fact that you had a foreign merchants, a group of foreign merchants coming in, where you needed somebody to be the translator in between the estates producing the wine and the guys selling it, and that became the broker. But over the centuries, of course, the system has evolved, but at its heart, it still remains the case that the estates in Bordeaux concentrate on making the wine. The merchants in Bordeaux concentrate on selling the wine, and in between them are the brokers who kind of match up the right estates with the right negociants. At its heart, that's what it is. There is so much wine in Bordeaux that is one of the main reasons that this has worked for so many years, because there is a vast amount of wine being produced here. Now, and we can argue about the En Primeur system all we want to, but if you take it what I said before, about 30% goes to big buyers in Switzerland, big buyers in Belgium, big buyers in France. They're not interested in going to 300 individual chateaus and working out different sales terms. They are interested in having logistically a single point of order of transactions, delivery, etc. The logistics for them works for En Primeur, and they don't want that to change. There is no question that it doesn't work as well for everybody. People like Sauternes, the chateaux of Sauternes, they have a tough time anyway. Again, figures, I know it's not always so exciting to talk about figures, but since 1980, the amount of sweet wine that's been produced in Bordeaux has dropped like a stone. It's like, now it's less than 2% of the whole of the production of Bordeaux. It used to be significant. Sweet wine and dry whites made about 60% of Bordeaux until the 70s. You know, I mean, it's a very recent thing. But now Sauternes have a very tough time, whether they're on the Place or not on the Place, sadly. Sauternes probably benefit more than anybody from the tours that are arranged around the world of the Union de Grand Cru. So if they're lucky enough to be within these big kind of global, or not global, but these big groupings of prestigious chateaus, then they're lucky because they might just get in front of buyers in New York and London, etc., which they don't do normally. So I think we have to take Sauternes slightly to one side. The Place is, at its heart today, a brilliant branding machine. It works in terms of bringing your brands up and distribution. I want to give you two interesting, I think, examples of that. How many people have heard of Chateau Puget? Chateau Puget, P-O-U-G-E-T. That is a fourth growth in the 1855 classification in Margaux. It is not a well-known estate. One of the reasons I would say for that is because it is not sold through the Place. So it is 1855, it's classified, it should in theory have all the glamour that 1855 brings on it, and yet it's distributed through exclusivity. So it simply doesn't have the kind of, you know, the recognition that the Place can bring. Another estate is called Coin-Slaughton. Coin-Slaughton is a Cru Classé de Grave. It's a gorgeous, brilliant, brilliant white wine. It has been traditionally sold just through the André Lawton system of selling. They are a very big company. They have a ton of wine. They have their own sellers who've done a great job around the world for their lower level estates. But at the level that Coin-Slaughton is, which is an excellent quality classified wine, again, it doesn't really have the visibility that it should. And I was just speaking to Jacques Lawton today. His father, André, passed away last year, and he's come to join the estate. He's come to run the estate. And the first thing he said is he's going to put that back onto the Place because he wants the distribution and also the kind of prestige that being on the Place can bring. Because the way that it works is the chateaus, again, they just think about making the wine, and then they kind of outsource the marketing of it to these negociants who go around the world. And the big difference today, let's say 10 years ago, those negociants would just happily go off. They wouldn't bother telling the chateaus who was buying it. In fact, they would actively stop the chateaus from knowing who was buying it because they didn't want to give away all of their clients. Today, no good chateau puts up with that. Today, it's a partnership, and the chateaus know where it's going, and they will say to the negociants, you know what, I don't want to be entirely in China. I want to make sure that you've got me stuff in Brazil and in wherever. And it's very, very much a partnership for the good ones. But it's still a very, very important branding exercise.
I'm going to come back. There are one or two questions that spring out of that. We've got some very good questions, though, from the floor. I'd like to, which not necessarily talking about that level of wine, but Amber LeBeau, Amber Spitbucket, who's regular attendee and speaker. Amber, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. In the US, I worked for a retailer that sold a lot of Bordeaux in the US, and I always had such a tough time reaching younger drinkers, millennials, and wasn't even going to try with Generation Z. I mean, the image of Bordeaux being complicated and stuffy was such a hurdle to try to overcome. Is there any plans among the Bordelais to do some targeting, marketing, talk up their sustainability or elsewise to counter that?
So that is already happening. So this is one of the things that I have tried very, very hard in Inside Bordeaux to talk about and to show, because what's actually happening in Bordeaux is you have appellations like Saint-Emilion who are making it obligatory, if you're going to have the name Saint-Emilion on your label, that you have to have some kind of green viticulture. So you have to either be organic or biodynamic, or a little less impressively, but HVE3, you have to be doing something that is certified towards making your wine greener. So those kind of things are cool. In Margaux, you have a massive biodiversity kind of project where 70% of the appellation has signed up to be sure that they are doing a lot of things to encourage biodiversity. And that's because the president of Margaux for the last 15 years has been a guy called Gonzague Lawton, who is himself works biodynamically, and he's done a very good job of trying to convince the Margaux appellation to kind of get on board. You have high profile estates like Pontet Canet, like Fontplegard, like Palmer, that are all biodynamic. And also you have a ton of small producers who are doing really, really super exciting things, like being sure that they plant trees for every hectare of vines that they're planting, trying to make sure that they really are doing things that show their commitment to farming in a different way than Bordeaux may have done traditionally. What they haven't, I agree with you, and as you say, but how is that stuff being conveyed? So the stuff like the Saint-Emilion having to be on the label, they themselves are, but certainly maybe they're not doing a good enough job, but they are certainly talking about it. They're certainly trying to show that rules are changing to ensure that people kind of sign up to all this kind of stuff. You have small estates. Let me think of a couple of estates like Chateau Antonic up in the Medoc, who are doing all of these ecoforestry is not the right word, but doing sustainable forestry. They're also working with young disadvantaged people in the Bordeaux region to bring them to the estate and to work for a year for free to learn about organic farming. And they've set up a network of other organic estates across Bordeaux to do the same thing. So to work with disadvantaged young people, to give them a skill, a specific skill in organic farming. These projects are happening. Maybe they're not doing a good enough job. That's certainly one of the things, as I say, I really try to focus on in Inside Bordeaux, because I agree with you, it's important. And it's worth doing, because nowadays all of us want to know more about the stories behind the wine. We want to know that we're drinking something which somebody has made. That's one of what I have felt most frustrated about with Bordeaux, that they haven't always done a very good job of that, of showing that there are real people behind these bottles who are really doing, and they really care about what we drink in the end.
Jane, can I come back to your book in a sense, and it's relevant to this whole picture. There's real people, there's also real places, and you talked about the regions within Bordeaux.
By the way, I'm drinking.
So we had I can see that. So we had a lady on the other day called Sally Evans, who's got a vineyard in Fronsac.
Yeah.
And Fronsac is one of my favorite bits of Bordeaux. It's got real slopes, which the Medoc doesn't have a lot of. And it's where the Romans made great wine, and where Mouex used to have some very nice chateau and so on. And I would buy Fronsac wines if I was looking at Bordeaux very readily. But it feels unloved these days. And it seems to me that, and I've got friends who've had chateaus in for example, in Listrac, and you can see quite ordinary wine from Margaux sits on a shelf and somebody will buy it for a reasonable price without question. You really have to break various parts of your anatomy to make anything in Listrac or Moulis maybe a bit easier to hit anything like the prices that you do in, say, Margaux or maybe some of those other appellations. Isn't that a problem within Bordeaux that even Lalande de Pomerol you talk about, for example, some absolutely delicious wines there?
A huge problem for the producers, but it goes back to the fact that Bordeaux is so big. It goes back to that it's easier for buyers to kind of plump all of Margaux together. And again, you're right, I don't mean to just plug inside Bordeaux, but that again is something that I've tried to talk about. And that's why I wanted to talk more about terroir and soil of Bordeaux, the stuff that people don't normally talk about. And one of the reasons they don't talk about it is because it's complicated. It's so bloody complicated in this region because it's big. And it isn't just, it's all gravel on the left bank, it's all clay on the right bank. There are lots of different areas which have different types of soils and climate, etc., on the different banks. And once you start to kind of know a little bit about that, then you suddenly can break free of this idea that, oh, I must buy Saint-Emilion because it's great. In fact, you can think, oh, I can see that there's just as good types of soils and with great elevation and slopes in Fronsac, and I don't need to pay a Saint-Emilion price. And Lalande de Pomerol, there are little spots of Lalande which are just over the border from Pomerol, which have got some of the best terroir in the whole of Bordeaux, but people don't know about it, and they think, oh, it's not Pomerol, so it can't be as good. So that's really, I've really tried, and I mean this in terms of wanting to empower people and me to be able to make those decisions of not having to be slavishly led by what the appellation says.
And we talked a little bit earlier about the chateau. I'm going to come back to the younger drinker question. We've got some from Alan Liska, but I want to come back to something else that does apply to how we could make Bordeaux more interesting and more attractive to a wider audience. If we were looking at another large French region with varied harvests and vintages and complexities and different mixes of grapes, you've got Champagne, you've got big brands, non-vintage, reliable wines. To an extent, you have the same in Côte de Rhône. Okay, you have vintages working there. Bordeaux, you've got all these little names. You've got some big brands, and obviously some of them are quite famous. But to be blunt, I don't drink Mouton Cadet when I see it on a list. I've had it good sometimes. I've had it less good a lot of times. And I like Doit #1. There are a few others, but there aren't the Champagne style. There's not the number of really good, reliable, branded Bordeaux's that I would have thought would have brought people into the region in the way that, for example, actually Guigal, Côte de Rhône does very well for the Rhône, or Duboeuf does for Beaujolais has done. Why has it been so difficult for Bordeaux to create that kind of level of, that kind of brand?
So obviously Champagne has the advantage in some ways of being able to blend across years. They have, for the non-vintage, gives them the ability to deal with the same thing that Bordeaux has, which is not great vintages every year. Bordeaux has, for whatever reason, not chosen to go down that route. And I know that you yourself had some experience of trying to sell a non-vintage Bordeaux and finding that the market didn't get it. And I know of a number of examples of that in Bordeaux as well, where for good and bad, they have pinned their mask to the idea of vintage, and that's what's happening. And therefore it becomes very difficult for a brand to truly be consistent year on year. Because the great thing about Bordeaux chateaus is that they're not consistent year on year. That's one of the truly wonderful things about Bordeaux, that you can rediscover every year. You have, in the best estates, there's a signature, but it differs. You can have a new conversation each year, and that's a lovely thing. And evidently that is not what brands need or want. So it is difficult. And I agree with you that, you know, there are some brands here which work, but I don't think that will ever be the true strength of Bordeaux. And when you look at the big estates here, Lafite is 110 hectares. You know, these are big estates. So they themselves do manage to have emblematic wines which you can sell around the world and which taste the same no matter where you are, because they make enough of it.
This is slightly going off at a tangent before we forget it. We've got a question from Lorenzo Visconti. What is the share of En Primeur on total Bordeaux sales? I think it's one that's worth answering.
It's about
hard to guess that, but
it's about 3 to 5%. It's small.
In value.
In volume, but in value.
In volume. So value, it's going to be higher.
Yes, if I'm not talking just about En Primeur, but in terms of the classified, those big estates, they're about 3 to 5% of volume and about 20% of value.
And we have since we've got to En Primeur, I think I will ask Guy Woodward to actually, but it's a short question, I thought I'll answer on his point. What are our views on the validity and prudence of an En Primeur campaign this year? So we discussed this a few weeks ago when we didn't think there was going to be one. And now, you've been busily tasting 2019. So what do you think?
So I'm pretty sure now that there will be an En Primeur campaign this year. And I think we're going to see it in June and July. I think that it will start to happen in June and July. I think it will be much reduced. My expectation is that we will see maybe 100 estates selling En Primeur rather than the usual 200. The big question is, what will they do with prices? I said last time, and I would say it again, that what they should be doing is looking at what happened in 2008, where they just accepted the reality of what was happening globally, and they priced at a way that made people come to the market to buy. And it didn't make them suffer, because in 2009, people had made money in 2008, so they were happy and they bought 2009. Will the Bordelais do this? Every year, I think they're going to be sensible and price sensibly, and every year they don't. So I sadly don't have enough sway to make them do that. But I strongly think that they are insane if they don't price at least 2014 prices. If they try to go higher, I really think that they won't find the buyers. Because today, it seems to me that we do have a problem across the whole of Bordeaux, where apart from the top 50, which will always find buyers, that's not really a problem. When we get down to number 120 on the list of En Primeur sellers, if you like, you haven't got as many people in New York or London, or indeed in France, and certainly not in China, who are fighting to get hold of those wines, are they? No, but this comes back to the fact that En Primeur isn't just about those high profile, and they don't necessarily look for the same buyers. In fact, they do not look for the same buyers. So it goes back to this point that a third of En Primeur goes to big scale buyers like the supermarkets across Europe. And if they're not there, that will be a real worry for those estates. That's kind of what I mean, because there's nowhere else to go. Yeah, exactly. We can't say we'll take it to Shanghai, we'll take it somewhere else. Those markets are no longer as interested as they were. So back to that question. So Alan Liska still wants to pick up on that question. I see if I can get Alan on to ask it himself. Alan Liska, you are there. Alan, where are you, by the way? Alan is in Washington.
Yes, in Washington, D.C. Hey, Jane, how are you?
Hey, how nice to hear your voice. I'm very well. How are you?
Great, and very good to see you and hear your voice. So I kind of want to follow up on the question that Amber asked earlier, and going along with what you said. I see when I go out to Bordeaux, all of the things the Chateau are doing that appeal to what it should appeal to the younger generation. All the things you talked about, biodynamic and green harvesting and green growth and all the sustainable things they're doing. But then when I go to Bordeaux events here in the United States, one, they tend to be expensive, $150, $250 US dollars, a person, and they're all filled with old people like me. In fact, I go to these events to feel young, because at 50, I'm in the younger age group. So I guess my question is, how can the Bordeaux estates translate the cool things that they're doing that should appeal to younger buyers to events that will also appeal to younger buyers, without coming off as pandering, looking like old people trying to appeal to younger buyers? Thank you, Alan.
It's a good question, and I'm sure they are scratching their own heads about exactly that. They have They have started to do a better job of reaching out to sommeliers, but still not a good enough job. They have started to do a better job of trying to hit different demographics, but again, they need to do a better job of getting different people talking about the wines than just the same people who always do. And I of course, that I'm lucky enough to be one of those people. But the reality is they need to get better at opening up their Rolodex, as you say, and reaching out to different types of people who hit different markets. You know, James Suckling, in fact, does a pretty good job at his tastings globally of reaching a younger demographic and having music, making it fun, making it a more interesting environment to go and taste the wines. And Bordeaux could definitely learn quite a lot from these, from just other ways of reaching out. I think we will see changes because they're aware of it, but the Bordelais are not always their best, best advocates. I think that's the reality. They're not.
Thanks for that. Stan Novak, who's another regular, has got a question about the elephant in one of the elephants in the room, in terms of, since the discovery that Merlot is a bit of a problem in the climate change, we've now got a whole range of other grapes, including Marselan and Touriga Nacional and Alvarinho and all sorts of things that would have been unthinkable as concepts for Bordeaux 5-10 years ago, suddenly have become. So Stan, do you want to ask that question? Sorry, I'm asking it for you. Stan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I was asking you a question. Why didn't you ask your question? I apologize.
Okay, sorry. So good evening, everybody. So my question is about these grape varieties, and I also want to know how it will affect these large chateaus, this Cru Classé.
Okay, so are we good? So two replies to that, Stan. One is that it will not come in until 2021. So at the moment, it is a suggestion, they are talking about it, that nobody is allowed to plant those new varieties yet. It's waiting for the the INAO, which is what the National Appellations Origin guys, to say yes or no. So assuming they say yes, from 2021, the states will be able to start planting small amounts, but not the guys we're talking about. The classified growths will not be allowed to do it because it will only apply to AOC Bordeaux, AOC Bordeaux Superior, AOC Bordeaux Blanc, and I think the Côte de Bordeaux. I think those are the 4 appellations right now that will be allowed to do it. So they are very conscious that they do not want to change the character of the classified growths. I think what we'll see much more, and we already are seeing, over the next decade as a result of climate change, is more Petit Verdot, more Malbec. We'll see these kind of grapes which are already allowed within the Bordeaux rules, but which have higher acidity and that resist better to heat. I've really enjoyed seeing the rise of Malbec. Malbec in the 19th century was a huge deal in Bordeaux, and then it kind of fell away because it just couldn't get ripe enough. And it's coming back, especially on the coasts and these smaller appellations. You're starting to see really a significant amount of Malbec. And Petit Verdot, again, a grape I love. It's spicy, it's interesting. We've seen it in the Medoc for quite a long time, but now you see it in Saint-Emilion as well. There's quite a few, probably 4 or 5 classified Saint-Emilions that have got Jon Figeac's one. It's not classified, but it's a good estate. Couvent des Jacobins. They have significant amounts of Petit Verdot over in Saint-Emilion. So I think we're going to see more of that.
Thank you. I've got a question from Lorenzo Viscontin, who is marketing consultant in Italy, and I think it's an interesting one. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, my question is, since complication is so intrinsically in the structure of the Bordeaux wine proposition, why don't use it as a relevant positioning mark, instead of try to overcome this problem?
Sorry, I'm just...
The point is, like in Italy, always talking about the problem of Italian offer being so fragmented.
Yeah.
It is, It's not something you can solve. So use it as a strength instead of as a weakness.
You know, I love that. I love you saying that, because that is exactly what I am talking about in Inside Bordeaux, and exactly what we're saying about here. This idea that just because it's Saint-Emilion, it means it's better than something in Montagne Saint-Emilion is just not true. And one of the big problems that Bordeaux has had is tying itself up in knots, because it's such a complicated region and there's so much difference in different parts. And I could not agree with you more. It would be far better and more honest if they would embrace that complexity.
So can I now chip in? And there's two thoughts. I know that Polly's going to have a marketing question, because she's always got 2 or 3 really good marketing questions up her sleeve. I'm going to ask one, which is that you made the point that the chateau didn't know who they were selling their wine to. That was historically, they do now. No, well, yes and no. I'm going to throw the ball back at you. They now know which merchant they're selling the wine to. In terms of direct to consumer, where producers all over the rest of the world actually will tell you how many individuals in Washington, D.C. and in Boston and so on, who they've got relationships with the people who are drinking their wine. That has not historically been the case with the Bordeaux. It's because of the way they sold their wine. And I've talked to Bordeaux Chateau owners and said, you know, how big is your list of people that you relate to? And it's not very often that big. Now, I do agree that's changing, and it has to change with obviously the move with social media and so on. But it's been slow, hasn't it?
It has, and you know, I wonder if COVID-19 will at least speed that up. You know, if we can pick some benefits out of the horrible situation we've all been living in for the last couple of months. One thing for Bordeaux is they've certainly very quickly understood that reaching out directly to consumers and showing this human face and using digital channels, all these things are very, very important. Because right now, what do you need to do? You need to build loyalty. You need to be there and show that you're there with the people who are consuming your brand, whatever your brand is. And that is, I'm sure, something that we're going to see changing. You know, there's a really good point that Alan brought up, and I think that it's important in this same context, which is that when you go around the world to the UGC tastings, everything's expensive, and they do meet consumers, but they meet consumers that have paid $140 to get to that tasting and say, oh my God, your wine's so amazing. And the chateaus aren't getting a really good incentive to then drop their prices the next time it comes around, because they're not enough in front of the real consumers. So I think they need to find a better way to reach out directly to the end consumer. But going back, once again, this is why Bordeaux is complicated. It works in many, many, many ways for the chateaus, the way the system is now. So they have to evolve without losing what they have. And if I can give a potential, not necessarily a solution, but something to think about, which is we now have over 100 international wine brands on the Place de Bordeaux. So it started out being, you know, Opus One, Senna, these high profile estates. Today you have over 100, not just from Napa and Italy, we have them from Germany, we have them from all over the world. They have shown, I think, the négociants and the chateaus a very, very, very good way to work with the Place de Bordeaux, which is that they do not in any way relinquish their relationships with the end consumers, and they very carefully direct the négociants where they want them to go. They get feedback at all times over what's happening, and they are the best possible partner for the négociants. And I think the chateaus haven't historically been as good a partners as they should be, and that needs to change. And they can definitely learn from how these international wine brands are using the Place.
Polly, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, I mean, I have more of a comment to begin with, and I'm so sorry for any of the Bordelais listening. The system, every time we have to go in and do any discovery, any research, it always feels unresilient. I mean, it feels entrenched. It's not quick to adapt. You mentioned early on that one of the things you really wanted to include in this book were the stories of, let's say, younger producers, newer producers. You know, we can't even use the term generation because they're so multi-generational that we can be talking about younger generations, and they're still entrenched in their French old school Bordelais ways. You know, can you tell us some stories of younger, newer producers who are trying to become more resilient and break out of that mold that's just such a part of all these questions that we're getting?
So yes, there are absolutely tons of them. One thing I would say exactly with what you're talking about in terms of how they need to get more, better at communicating. While I was researching for Inside Bordeaux, I would do my own research on all the chateaux, and then my publishers would often check the websites to check obviously they're checking thank God, they're good editors, they're checking what I've done. I cannot tell you, 90% of the time the website was wrong, my information's right, because they haven't updated the website in so long that they have evolved, but they haven't told anyone about it. For me, that sums up the problem often with Bordeaux. There are so many stories. There's a chateau, to take quite a high profile, but a real cult wine in Bordeaux. There's one called Chateau Le Puy. Chateau Le Puy, which is in Franc Côte de Bordeaux. It's been there for centuries. It's biodynamic. It's owned by this very old school, brilliantly, hilariously old school French family. But they're such a cult wine that a Brooklyn band has written a song about them. They were in the Drop of the Gods manga. They have like standing stones, a bit like a mini Stonehenge that is at the estate, where you go and you feel, or they say that it kind of gives all this energy off to the vines. They do a lot of just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful wines that are also incredibly high quality. I've been to a tasting of going back 100 years of their wines, back to 1914, and they're a Côte de Bordeaux wine, and yet age for 100 years. They are a fabulous, fabulous estate. And yet, often in Bordeaux, they're not given the appellation. Every year you have to be tested to see if you are allowed to put the appellation on your label. They don't pass it every year because they're very natural. They don't use any high sulfur, and often they can be called atypical of their estate. And that is an example of Bordeaux cutting off its nose to spite its face, because they couldn't be better ambassadors for what Bordeaux does, and yet often the Bordelais don't recognize it. So the stories are there. I promise you, it's finding them, and I hope that I can help by talking about them.
So between you, Polly and Jane, you've actually done the beautiful thing of actually moving me into the next section, which is really what I want to do, which is the thing that I never used to be interested in as a wine writer nearly as much was distribution. I was interested in how you made the wine and what it tasted like and so on. How it actually got to people wasn't the thing that I focused on. And the same applies to books. I remember I used to judge wine books on a regular basis. I've written a fair few of them, including a slim volume on Bordeaux ages ago. But how do you get a book published? How do you get a book to people? And you've done 5 books, I believe. And when we were talking about it before, you made the point that you hadn't necessarily gone down the traditional route. Now, whether it's the Place de Bordeaux for bottles of wine or going through a wine importer, you normally, if you're writing a book, you go to a traditional publisher and say, hello, my name is Jane or Robert, whoever, would you like to buy my book on X? And they either sell it or they don't. You've been through a different route. Can you talk us through, over the 5 books you've done, how that happened?
Yes, so like all journalists and like all freelance journalists, certainly that if you really want to make this a long time career, if you want to have a name which people will regularly want to pay to read and be commissioned to read, then writing books is a very good way of being taken more seriously and establishing yourself. So after I'd been in Bordeaux for a while, I knew that was what I wanted to do. One thing to say, I didn't turn down the first book I was offered. I wrote travel books first of all. I did a series of small lovely Thomas Cook, started a lot of writing careers. I did 2 pocket guides, one to Corsica, one to Southwest France. So I just so that I could say that I'd done a book. So in my own head more than anything. Anyway, then my first book is called Bordeaux Legends, and it was about the 5 first growths of Bordeaux. I was looking for, I never wanted to write, I wanted to write something that was interesting to me and that hadn't been done before. So it was looking for the right subject. When I came across this subject, which is why are these 5 chateaux the first growths? Why them? Why not others? So I put them together, and I went to Paul Pontellier at Margaux and asked if I could write this book. And my first thought was to follow him for a year, follow all 5 of them for a year. He agreed that I could do it, and I then got the other 5 to agree. And then I wrote my synopsis. I sent my synopsis not to a publisher, I sent my synopsis to an agent, a brilliant agent in London. He accepted it. And I just thought, great, I've done my synopsis, I've got an agent, well, now I'll just sit back and that will be that. But what actually happened, and he's you know, very good, high profile, nobody could do better than him, but he went to different publishers. We came close a couple of times, but I was a totally unknown quantity. I hadn't written a wine book before. I'd been a co-author of things like the opus, the wine opus with Dawn Kindersley. And it was a book that wasn't a book of recommendations. Most wine books are books to a list of wines to buy and to drink. So anyway, long story short, he couldn't get a publisher. But I knew this book had to be written, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to have to go a different way. And I was lucky because I was writing about the first growths, and one of them, in fact, Aubryon, put me in touch with a publisher in Paris who are contract publishers. So they're people, they're called Éditions de la Martinière, one of the best publishers in France for that style of book. Beautiful, beautiful layouts, glossy pages, really gorgeous. But they're used to publishing books under contracts, i.e. that have already got their distribution sorted out. So I went to see them in Paris, and they said, yes, I could remember, by the way, wearing the most ridiculous high-heeled boots. I really couldn't walk in, but I thought it made me look really, really businesslike. So I wore these ridiculous boots. I'm so embarrassed when I think about it. I have never worn them since. Anyway, they said, yes, we'll publish the book, but you have to sell 2,000 copies before we will take it on. So basically what you could do today, I guess, through crowdfunding, through Kickstarter, like some brilliant books like Simon Wolfe's Amber Revolution have done. And I'm a writer. Robert, you have made that leap over to selling. It didn't come naturally to me for sure. But I thought, you know what? I want this bloody book published. I know it's a good idea. So I picked up the phone and I called every negociant I knew. I called wine merchants in the UK. I called wine lovers in Hong Kong, and I sold 2,000 copies. I'm still really, really proud of having done that. And once I'd sold those, then Éditions de la Martinière said, fine. And then they published 5,000 in French and 5,000 in English.
Which is a lot of books.
Which is a lot of books. And we sold the 5,000 into the American market, went within about 6 months. It was incredibly successful. But the French version wasn't so much. They didn't market it. And I was naive at the time. I didn't really know that as the author, you have to do the marketing. You have to be responsible for that side of it. And I didn't. Anyway, so they didn't republish. So in fact, it's never been republished. And it's one of the few wine books that's gone up quite significantly in price because it was only ever 5,000 copies in America and England. And I did something quite ballsy, really, and that I would totally, I don't really know how I even had dared to do it, but I asked Francis Ford Coppola to write the foreword because I knew he was on the board at Latour. I never met him, but I had a lovely, lovely friend here called Lorraine who did PR for them. And I asked her to send him the manuscript, and he read it and he liked it. And he said, yes, I'll do the foreword. So having the name Francis Ford Coppola on the Coppola, as we say in England, on the cover of my first book made a big difference. I'm sure that helped sell out so quickly in the States. Anyway, so that was my first book. And I didn't have, but from that point, I didn't use my agent. Partly because I was embarrassed. I was so naive. I felt like I'd failed him by not selling the book for him the way that I thought in my mind that books should be sold. So from there, the other books I've done, I haven't had an agent, and it's worked out well, where sometimes I've done it with chateaux. I've done a book about Chateau Angelus with Éditions de la Martinière as well. But I was very careful to say, I don't want this to be a hagiography. I don't want it to be you telling me what to write. And they were very, very good at saying, here are our archives, here are, you do what you want to do. And so I wrote really about the context. I wrote about the history of Santamillion. I really like that book now when I reread it. And I've done a self-publishing with a friend of mine who's a photographer called Andy Katz, where he really did the book, and I wrote.
A great photographer.
He's a wonderful photographer. And there again, we were responsible for the distribution ourselves. And then I did it one traditional, proper traditional, but with a traditional publisher called Wine Revolution, which was great, with the wonderful Quarto in England. That was a great experience. I absolutely loved it. I can see why people use traditional publishers, except I had a very short lead time. That's what happens nowadays with wine books. I was given about really 4 months to write the text, and there were 50,000 words maybe. It was great. It looks beautiful. I loved that book. It was about organic biodynamic wines globally. I'm so grateful that they allowed me to move beyond Bordeaux and write about other regions. It was really a great experience. But with this book now, Inside Bordeaux is not through a traditional publisher. It's through BB&R Press. So they're owned by Berry Brothers. They're a totally separate arm, the same guys who did Inside Burgundy with Jasper Morris 10 years ago. And what they've allowed, so basically what's important to bear in mind with BB&R Press is that they're run by traditional publishers. They're run by this guy called Chris Folks, who used to, has worked really for all of his career in wine publishing. And
he was at Mitchell Beasley, which did the Wine Atlas and did everything.
Exactly, he headed up all of those things. He's really a very important figure in wine publishing in England. And he knew what to do. He's incredibly professional. And what BB&R allowed me to do, which I honestly don't think would have happened with a traditional publisher, is they allowed me to take the time to write this book. So this has been 3 years from beginning to end. They also allowed me to have the budget to write this incredible book and to get people like, we have worked with Kees van Leeuwen, who's a professor here in Bordeaux, who is the world expert on soils, terroirs, all of that kind of stuff. And we were able to commission him to do new maps for this book and to take the time to, to spend with us. And it's just turned it into a very, very different kind of book, and something which I'm so proud of. And I think they, it's really thanks to them. And it's because they are not traditional publishers. So they're able to take that, to step back a bit and allow me to do it.
Can we just actually, I'm going to invite, I've got Simon Wolf here, who's actually, we all know, and is actually going to be speaking with us about orange wines or amber wines quite soon as well. But I think it's interesting because Simon, your book on amber wines, which has done pretty well in terms of sales and prizes. You went down, this is slightly as an aside to the conversation we're having with Jane, but I think it does fit. You went down a different route in terms of publishing that as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. But I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. I wasn't nearly as well established as Jane was, I don't think, when I decided that I wanted to do this book. So I did try, first of all, I tried to get a publisher just because I thought it would be a good exercise. And I spent about a year writing a proposal. I got 13 rejections from just about every publisher around the world that's still interested in publishing wine books. And after that, I could see, okay, this isn't going to work. And I realized that publishing has become a very risk-averse industry these days. And I think I'm very interested to hear about how Jane got these books published, because I think what most people don't realize is that there are many more hybrids in the publishing world these days. There are many more different arrangements. Everybody used to think it's all about the traditional publisher. You get an agent or not, you get an advance, you write the book. But there are so many different kind of deals going on these days. And I think a lot of smaller publishers are really more distributors than anything else. So I realized that if I could fund my book, if I could crowdfund it, if I could prove that there was an audience, then actually that was the first bit of the puzzle. And all I really needed after that was distribution. So
and Simon,
can I interrupt?
Can I also, Simon, you said something really interesting to me earlier today about the foreign language editions. Could you talk about that?
Certainly, and that was really unexpected. So, I mean, many authors know, and Jane, I'm sure you'll have come across this, that if you sign a publishing deal, you either, if you're naive, you sign all your rights away for foreign rights. But even if you get a good deal, you lose 50% of the money for any foreign language editions of the book. And really, when I came to publish my book, I had no expectations that there would be foreign language editions. But then people started contacting me and saying, we'd like to do this in Korea, we'd like to do this in Japan, we'd like to do this in Italy. And I was like, okay, well, that's great. And then I realized actually that as a self-published author, given that I was willing to negotiate and reasonably tech savvy about everything, I was actually in a very good place because I negotiated, you know, I've done 5 deals so far for 5 foreign language editions, and I get all the money for those deals. Whereas normally in a publishing environment, I would be surrendering 50% at minimum of that money to a publisher. So there are advantages, I think, to, you know, alternative ways of getting books out there.
Could I chip in just one thought? Both of you understand about how the part you've had to put into selling and promoting and getting your books out there. You're not relying, whether it's on BBR or on anybody else to sell them. But the other thing that I think is crucial is that, Jane, you mentioned that you had Chris Fuchs, who's actually in the audience here, who's a very professional publisher. You, Simon, I know had professional help in terms of editing and design and so on. So that the book, the Amber one, it's a beautiful looking piece of work, and it's been very, very well put together. And it's very professionally put together. I did a book years ago, which I sold to Tesco, which we did 35,000 copies of, an introduction to wine. But I had, again, my partner in the project. It was self-published effectively, but I had a partner who had been working for the Guinness Book of Records. And I think that anyone thinking about publishing their own book, it isn't just a question of sitting down and writing it yourself and hitting a publish button. Either of you want to throw in a response to that?
I'd love to say something about that.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I mean, I think, and I've seen other self-published authors make this mistake. You know, I've seen people do it right, and I've seen people do it wrong. And I think you're absolutely right. Just because you're self-publishing, the design standards shouldn't go down, the editorial standards shouldn't go down. So the first thing I did when I could see that I was able to crowdfund this project and actually make it happen was I started to look around for, you know, who can I hire as an editor. Then I also decided I'm not going to call in favors. I'm not going to try and get a friend to do it on the cheap, because there's no reason why this book shouldn't be at the same high standard. And actually the interesting thing was that a couple of colleagues of mine actually told me, they said, if you had done this book with a publisher, because it's such a niche book, they probably would have spent less money on it. So actually the time and effort they would have put into the design and the editing probably would have been less in the end.
So thank you for that. I think it's very helpful. So thanks for the contribution. And there's a very nice note from Christopher Fuchs in the chat talking about how doing a big book on Bordeaux is like a strategist planning to invade Russia. Don't. But I know that Chris has had a background in doing big books over the years, so I think that's made a big difference. Jane, just to come back, because I know we're just kind of a few minutes over on time. 2 things. One, before I forget, because it is you know, one of the great things about doing things live. Your book is in print and out there. So what's been happening at Ponte Canet in the last week was obviously too late to make your book. Can you share a little bit about this is the inside gossip in Bordeaux, that, and not just at Ponte Canet, I think 1 or 2 other things have been going on, but people leaving top estates. Anything can you talk us a little bit?
Sure. Well, one thing just quickly is the book isn't actually out on general sale yet. It's May the 27th that it goes on sale. What BBR are doing now is taking sign-ups. So you can pre-order it, but you can't actually buy it till the 27th of May. But just putting that to one side, yes, in fact, I think I wrote on Twitter as soon as I heard the news that Jean-Michel Combes leaving Ponte Canet is the first big news story in Bordeaux that is not inside Bordeaux, because it happened this week.
And what does it mean? What's
Yeah,
the
so
importance
basically,
of this story?
to sum it up, Jean-Michel Combes has been at Pontet-Canet for 31 years, and he has made a seismic impact, really, I would say up there with Paul Pontellier at Chateau Margaux, because he's turned Pontet-Canet. He was the technical director, not the owner, but what he did was turn Pontet-Canet towards organic biodynamic farming. And they did that about 10 years ago, when they were really ploughing their own furrow. There were not huge classified estates that dared to go biodynamic. And he said to the owner, his own estate, which is in a smaller part of Bordeaux, over on the right bank, had been biodynamic for a long time, and he believed in it. He knew it was going to be a good thing. And he said to the owner of Pontet-Canet, don't do it for a hectare. You either do it or you don't do it. And so all credit to Terroir, the owner, he said, okay, do it. So they turned the entire estate biodynamic. And over the last decade, since that happened, Pontet-Canet has risen in terms of what people think about it, in terms of the prices that it achieves. And today you can definitely say it goes toe to toe with the very, very best estates in Pauillac. So him leaving is like boom, shockwaves. I would say if you are anywhere in the world, if you are running in a high profile biodynamic estate, you have got to be thinking, do I pick up the phone to Alfred Terroir and see if I can get the gig at Pontet-Canet?
But also his reason for leaving, as I
okay,
understand.
So his reason for leaving is because he said he couldn't take the pressure. I have to say, I have not spoken to him anymore. He said the pressure had got too much. I see him quite regularly, and whenever I do, I often think, my God, that man takes. It is not just a job to him. Being biodynamic is no way just something about marketing. Every single vine in that estate he cared about and he looked at. And he had years like 2016 where it rained an awful lot till the end of June, 2018, massive mildew problems, which decimated the yield at Pontet-Canet. Same thing at Parma. And I think it became very, very, very difficult for him to continue. I think, with the stress of what that meant. And he would not compromise at any point because he believes so strongly in biodynamics. So I don't know, because I haven't spoken to him, but that would be my assumption of what he meant by the stress has got too much.
And I think finally, we've covered a lot of ground, and I know we're slightly over time, and I think you've got a family coming up behind you in the house. I have really the sort of final question, unless there's something else really you'd like to chip in, but what next? So you've done the books you've done, this magnum opus, you might well say no more books for the moment, just sort of actually get your head down and enjoy life a bit. But where do you go after doing that book?
So one of the things that I want to do with this book, and it goes back to what I've learned from the 4 books I've done so far, is to actually take the time, not to relax, but to take the time to sell this book so that people know that it's there and they know how useful it is, and how I honestly think this is a game changer in terms of how we can talk about Bordeaux and how we can learn about it and how we can just get, slightly excited about it again. So what I have done previously with my last books is, they didn't pay me enough for me to be able to take the time to stop and think, so I would immediately be going on to writing articles and writing my next book, etc. With this book, I want to take the time. Had we not had COVID-19, I would have been in New York next, I would have been in Amsterdam this week, I'd have been in New York in 2 weeks' time, and then Washington, DC, and blah, 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 blah. It would have been very exciting. Much better for the carbon emissions. I'm not doing that, and I'm doing it all via Zoom. But I still want to take the time to really talk about this book. And then I think next year I will start thinking about another book.
Jane, thank you very, very much again. It was wonderful having you, well, both the previous times. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I've loved every minute of it. And there's so much, just in all our best sessions, there's so many beginnings of other thoughts that we can actually follow up. And also thank you for sharing the information both on Bordeaux, but also on this whole publishing side, because I know it's something that caught a lot of interest in social media, and it's very nice to go into it. So thank you. Enjoy your evening in Bordeaux and get back to your family. Everybody, thank you for being around and following us. We've got some more fascinating sessions this week. Tomorrow night, Polly and I are doing something very different, and we only decided to do this approximately 93 minutes ago, which is we're talking about sex and wine. I'm not sure whether Polly's got it on the list as wine and sex or sex and wine.
I wanted to call it boobs and wine, but Robert wouldn't let me.
Well, the reason, I was actually all up for it, I have to say. The only reason for not going boobs and wine is we're actually going to look at the whole thing of selling wine to men, selling wine to women, how is that whole genderification, or whatever you call it. So you've got wines with names like Cupcake and Little Black Dress, but we've also got wines with names like Carnivore and 19 Crimes and so on. And to me, it's fascinating that wine has found itself almost in the fashion world, where, you know, turn left for wines for people with testicles and turn right for wines with people with ovaries, if you like. And there's a whole marketing world out there that looks at wines that way. So we're going to look at that tomorrow night. And then on Friday, we have Blake Gray, the very well-known Californian wine writer, who's talking about fact and fiction in wine writing. It's something that, Jane, I know that you'd find interesting. Basically, if you read the wine columns, you would believe that there's a Riesling revolution and everybody's drinking Riesling and sherry is booming and so on. And he's saying, actually, how many of these stories are real? How many of them are what the writer wants to write about and wants because he or she has seen it in their local town or whatever. So Jane, I'd love to have some of your thoughts on that if you're around on Friday. You may chip in a thought now if you like, but that's what we're doing then. Do you want to chip in something?
Amazing. I shall be listening.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Polly, as ever, for being my partner on this voyage. Thank you all. Stay safe. See you soon.
See you soon. Thanks so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.